Hi there, and thank you so much for joining me. So this video is going to be the only video in Module 7, and we are going to discuss different methods of sampling participants for the purposes of research. Okay. So one of the most important questions that you'll want to answer as a future researcher is you need to decide who your participants will be given your specific research question, and you also need to decide how you will select those participants, right? So for example, if you are a developmental psychologist who is interested in children's ability to take different perspectives during play, right, then you'll want to restrict your sample of participants to infants or toddlers or what have you. Right? Whereas if you are involved in the medical field and you're interested in, for example, how bone density declines with age, and that impact on physical activity and well-being of seniors, then you would want to isolate your sample to older individuals, right? So depending upon your particular research question, you might want all young people in your sample or only young people in your sample, or maybe you exclusively want older people, right? Or perhaps if you're interested in the extent to which younger people and older people are susceptible to the most deleterious consequences of COVID, right? Then you would want one sample of older adults and one sample of younger adults, right? So it really just depends upon your research question, what type of sample you would select. Okay. So let's suppose you want to learn about how students at Mercer view a proposed tuition increase, right? So in an ideal world, if you had unlimited resources, you might just ask every single student on campus their opinion about the tuition increase, right? And if you were able to gather responses from every single person on Mercer's campus, then you have measured the population. Right? So the population is the entire group of interest in a research study from which a sample is drawn, right? So if you're interested in Mercer students' attitude about a tuition increase and you spoke with every single student on campus, then you have measured the population, right? But unfortunately, questioning the entire population is usually impractical, right? Because you may not be able to identify all of the members of a population, particularly if that population is extremely large, right? So you might be able to find Mercer students who are psychology majors or Mercer students who are on campus, right, rather than learning online. But chances are you wouldn't be able to survey, right, or sample the entire population, right? And sometimes, even if you were able to identify the entire population, they might not want to participate in your study, right? So even if you could track them down, maybe they don't want to express their opinion about this tuition increase, right? So rather than question everyone in the entire population, researchers can simply study a subset of the population, and that subset is called a sample, right? So a sample is a subset of the population from which the researcher collects data. So using what we learn from the smaller group or the sample, we can make inferences concerning the larger population. Okay. So in order to do that, in order to extrapolate on the basis of a sample, what the population's views are, we need to develop what's called a sampling plan, right? Okay, because the sampling plan is going to determine how accurate those inferences based on the sample are, right? So a sampling plan is the explicit strategy used for recruiting participants from the population, okay? So one way to think about a sample, right, is that if you're interested in trying a new ice cream flavor, right, so you've never had Rocky Road before, and you go into an ice cream shop and they give you that tiny little spoon, right, and you fill up that tiny little spoon and take a taste, right, and the assumption that you're making is that if you were to sample the entire container of ice cream, it would taste the same as the sample that you're given, right? And that's the fundamental assumption that we're making here, is that whatever characteristics we find in our sample are going to be the same characteristics of the population, okay? So we want to make sure that we have what's called a representative sample, right? So a representative sample is a sample with specific features that characterize the population of interest, right? So how can we get a representative sample? Okay. So again, if we want to learn about the attitudes of students at Mercer, we should not simply collect data from our friends or classmates and then automatically assume that most students at Mercer hold similar attitudes, right? So in this case, your friends may not adequately or accurately represent all of the students at Mercer, right? So again, depending on who you are, your friends might be mostly males or mostly females. Your friends might be mostly psychology students or mostly students in their junior year, right? So in order to get a sample that best matches the population of interest, which is the entire Mercer community, then it's better to collect data on a variety of students on campus, right? So we want different majors represented. We want both commuter and residential students, right? And we also want four-year and transfer students, right? Just like if I was conducting an in-class experiment and I only used participants who are currently in my classes, right? All of those students would be students who are learning online, right? Or even if I taught during the day, right, during regular business hours on campus in person, I would be missing out on the attitudes of students, of non-traditional students, right? So maybe older jobs or older students who are taking classes while working a full-time job, or students with different family obligations, maybe a spouse and children, things like that, right? So we want to make sure that our sample is representative of all of the different characteristics that we would find in our population. So now we're going to talk about different methods of sampling, okay? So first we have what's called probability sampling. So probability sampling is a sampling approach in which everyone in a given population has an equal chance of selection for participation, right? So there's going to be a key distinction here. So we've already talked a lot about random assignment in this class, right? So random assignment means that you are in a sample already, okay? And that you have an equal probability of being put in an experimental group or a control group, or however many groups the experimenter has. So you have an equal chance of being selected for all of the different conditions of the experiment, right? Random sampling means that you have an equal chance of being selected from the population for participation, right? So everybody in the population has an equal chance of being selected to participate in the experiment, or everyone in your population has an equal chance of being chosen for the sample, right? Okay, and there are three different types of probability sampling. There's simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, and cluster random sampling. Okay, so we're going to look at each of these individually. So simple random sampling is a probability sampling method in which a subset of individuals are randomly selected from the population. Okay? So in this particular method, one way that you would achieve a simple random sample, right, is if you wrote down all of the students on Mercer's campus in alphabetical order, okay? And then perhaps you took a dice, right, or a die, and you rolled it, okay? And if you got the number 2, then you would take the second person on the list. If you got the number 4, you would take the 4th person on the list. If you got the number 8, you would take the 8th person on the list, and so on, right? So you're drawing names at random from the population for selection into your sample that you're going to use, right? But can you identify any potential problems with this method, right? We've already corrected somewhat our sampling method so that we have a more representative sample, right? So in this method, your friends are no more likely to participate than anybody else's friends, right? Because you're just choosing these names at random, okay? But what's a potential problem? Okay, so you've listed everybody's name in alphabetical order. And again, if you get a 3, you'll take the 3rd person on the list. If you roll an 8, you'll take the 8th person on the list, and so on until you reach your sample size, so until you have 50 people, let's say, right? But there's something wrong with this particular strategy. If you were to use this strategy, you may have 50 participants before you reach the end of the list, right? In which case, those at the beginning of the list, or those with last names near the beginning of the alphabet, are going to be more likely to be chosen than those with last names near the end of the alphabet, right? So in this case, it's actually not a representative sample because people don't really have an equal chance of being selected, right? People at the beginning of the list or at the beginning of the alphabet are more likely to be chosen for participation than people at the end, okay? So how do we fix this? Well, the easiest thing to do might be to take your list of participants and write each name on a slip of paper and place it in this little drum thing here, right? And shaking all the names up and selecting one at a time, right? That way you've got some people at the beginning of the alphabet, some people at the end, some people in the middle, and so on, right? So even though the dice method is random, you're still actually not getting a representative sample because there's not an equal chance of being selected, which you would achieve if you were to just randomly draw the names out of a hat, right? Or whatever device you're using. So stratified random sampling is a probability sampling method that includes dividing your population into subpopulations or strata and using a simple random sampling strategy to select participants from each strata in proportion to the population at large, right? So that's a lot of words. Let me give you a couple of examples. So for example, suppose you wanted to look again at attitudes about Mercer's tuition increase, okay? But to be more representative, you first want to divide participants by class, right? So you want freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and seniors, right? So to do this, you might create 4 lists and draw, say, 20 random names from each list until your total sample is comprised of members of each class, right? So you have 20 freshmen, 20 sophomore, 20 juniors, and 20 seniors for a total of 80 participants, right? And another example, say you are interested in investigating political attitudes among college students, and you know that in the U.S. population, 60% of college-age students are Democrat and 40% are Republican, right? And you again want your sample to be as representative of the population as possible. So maybe in that case, you would choose 6 Democrats and 4 Republicans for every 10 students that you sample, right? So first you decide what specific groups you want represented in your sample, and then you select the same number in each group for each group, okay? And next we have what's called area probability sampling. So before I define area probability sampling for you, let's go through each of these, right? So when you draw a simple random sampling, you randomly select one name from a group of everyone in the population. So you have a name from everyone in your population and you randomly select participants for your sample from the population. Okay. With stratified random sampling, you have multiple groups in the population that you want represented in your sample. So for example, maybe you want a sample of males, or you want 50% males in your population and 50% females, right? Then you would draw names from both of those jars, so to speak. Okay, with area probability sampling, this sampling strategy, the researcher first divides the population into subgroups based on geographic area and then randomly selects participants from each geographical subgroup, right? So going back to our example of looking at attitudes towards a tuition increase, right? Suppose in order to get the most representative sample from your population of all of Mercer students, maybe you look for freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and seniors, and you also look for some students from each of the dorms on campus, right? So you want people from both Smith Hall and Allen Hall and all of the dorms on campus, right? Okay. So next we have cluster random sampling. And students often confuse cluster random sampling with stratified random sampling. So I want to make this really clear for you, okay? So with cluster random sampling, you divide the total population into groups or clusters and then use simple random sampling to select which clusters will participate, and then all observations in a given cluster are included in the sample, right? So with stratified random sampling, you identify the groups that you're interested in, right? And then the unit that you sample is going to be individuals, right? So you make a list of freshmen, a list of sophomores, a list of juniors, and a list of seniors, and you randomly sample individual names. But with cluster random sampling, the unit that you're sampling is not individuals, but rather groups of individuals, right? So let me give you an example. Suppose you are a superintendent of a school district and you're interested in assessing job satisfaction of all teachers in your district, right? So let's suppose there are 20 schools in your district, okay? If you were to use cluster random sampling, you would randomly choose 5 of those 20 schools, okay? And then all the teachers in the 5 schools are sampled, right? So with stratified random sampling, you would just choose a random sample, maybe of 20 individuals from each school, each of those 20 schools. But with cluster random sampling, you're actually sampling the groups themselves, right? So in this case, if you've selected the 5th school on your list of 20 schools, then every single teacher in that school would be sampled or would participate. So what are some of the potential issues with probability sampling? Well, one of the main issues with probability sampling is that it makes the assumption that although your sample is different than the population, there are no biases in participant selection. So because everyone has an equal chance of being selected as part of your sample is representative of the population. And the problem with that is this assumption is a really difficult one to test, and it's also really difficult to meet that criteria, especially when your population that you're interested in is really big and there's lots of people. And also when it's hard to identify every member of your population, okay? If you don't have access to the entire population, right, it's very, very difficult to support the assumption that your sample is going to be representative of the population. So because we often can't uphold the assumption that our sample is representative of the population, particularly if that population is very large or we don't have access to everyone in the population, we often use different methods. So we use different methods because we can't uphold the assumption that our sample is representative of the population. and also because of the inherent difficulties of probability sampling, right? Probability sampling is just a lot more difficult than non-probability sampling. So most researchers use what's called non-probability sampling. So with non-probability sampling, everyone in the population does not have an equal chance of being sampled, and therefore there's a lot of potential for bias. Okay, so I'm going to go through each type of non-probability sampling, and then we'll talk about the limitations of non-probability sampling. So first we have what's called convenience sampling. So convenience sampling is a technique in which non-random selections of participants who are readily available to the researcher serve as the sample. So again, for example, suppose you wanted to learn about the opinions of students at Mercer regarding a proposed tuition increase. To make life easy, you decide to sample all of the students in your classes to gauge the attitudes of the entire student body. While this sample is certainly convenient, right, it may not reflect how most of the students at Mercer feel, right? So first, if you take mostly psychology classes, psychology majors will probably be overrepresented in your sample. If you only attend classes during the day, older students who attend night classes won't be represented. And also, like I was saying, you might be more likely to sample people that you know as opposed to people that you don't know, simply because people that you know are going to be more likely to agree to participate in your study, right? And while this seems like a minor issue, failing to account for non-traditional students could result in something like an age bias, right? If you only have young people in your sample, and therefore it's not going to be representative. Okay. So again, when we have certain students that are more likely to participate in our experiment than other students, we have what's called a selection bias. Right? And a selection bias, again, just means that certain people are more likely to participate or are more likely to be in your sample than other people, right? So like I said, you're more likely to have younger people rather than older people. And we see the same thing with, for example, TV shows and other things maybe on the radio or websites where they use opinion surveys to sort of garner attitudes about celebrities or political issues or whatever, right? So it's important to acknowledge when we see these things on maybe American Idol or a news poll, right? That any information that we can take away from them probably isn't representative of Americans in general, right? Rather, it's probably more likely that people responding to these opinion polls are going to be those who have really, really strong opinions, right? And care a lot about whether those opinions are known, right? So only if you have a very extreme position on something are you likely to share your opinion, right? And as we've talked about before, if you were to administer your surveys by phone, you're more likely to hear from, for example, older, retired people or people who are unemployed, right? And those are certainly important subsets of the population, but they might not be representative of the population at large. Okay, then we have quota sampling. So quota sampling is a sampling technique that freely chooses any participant as long as they meet an established quota. Okay. So let's say, for example, that you're a researcher who wants a sample of 100 people that is 70% Christian. Okay, so that's your specific quota. So that researcher can randomly select people from the population, asking their religion each time. Once they reach 70 Christians, they can continue to select at random until they reach 100 participants, but they'll only accept people who don't identify as Christian to be part of the sample. Right? Same thing if you want 50% of your sample to be smokers and 50% of your sample to be non-smokers, right? Then if you have 100 people, you can select 50 smokers, right? But after you reach that quota, you need to make sure that the rest of your sample are non-smokers, okay? So you have some established quota, and you need to meet that quota, and that determines the number of participants in a given category that you select. Next, we have something called purposive sampling. So purposive sampling is usually a technique that's employed when you're dealing with highly specialized or highly skilled samples. Okay, so in this case, the researcher chooses the sample or chooses participants from the population for the sample based on who they think would be appropriate for the study. Okay, so this is used with a limited number of people who have expertise in whatever you're investigating. So for example, people who study working memory are particularly fascinated with individuals who are chess experts because it's been documented that they are much better than the random population or non-chess experts when it comes to memorizing, for example, particular chess positions. So for that particular study, you would want to isolate your sample to people who have X number of hours playing chess, or maybe who have won a lot of awards in chess tournaments, etc. Maybe if you're interested in people who have PhDs, okay, and you want to look at their maybe cognitive abilities or the stressors that they encounter, then you would isolate your sample to individuals who have doctoral degrees. If you're interested in looking at the brains of bird watchers, for example, or individuals who have worked with cars, right? Because you think that the FFA, which is an area of the brain specialized for visual stimuli that we're familiar with, if you want those individuals, then again, you would draw a purposive sample with bird watching experts or car mechanics or something like that. Okay? Okay. Snowball sampling. Snowball sampling is a technique in which existing study participants recruit future participants from among their acquaintances. So why might we do a snowball sampling? Well, snowball sampling is usually a technique that gets employed when you're investigating a rare disease, right? So in this case, a researcher randomly selects 10 people from a subject pool to participate in an experiment, and then asks each participant to have their friends contact them if they wish to participate, right? So this is typically something that we see in like a clinical trial for particularly rare diseases. So for example, a lot of studies looking at terminal diseases or cancers or really pervasive neuropsychiatric disorders might be interested in recruiting acquaintances of participants because those participants are likely to be involved in maybe other clinical trials or support groups or things like that. So they might have access to other individuals who are also suffering from that particular type of cancer or genetic disorder or neuropsychiatric disorder, right? So for example, Rett syndrome is a genetic brain disorder, okay, which typically becomes apparent between the ages of 6 to 18 months in children. And they have a lot of really significant symptoms. So there's difficulty with language, coordination, and repetitive movements. There's slower growth and problems with walking and things like that. So it's a very, very significantly disabling disorder. And there's a lot of federal funds that are used for research into this particular disorder. So the way that kids are often recruited for the study is through existing participants who might have acquaintances who also have kids with this disorder. Okay, so now that I have discussed each of the non-probability sampling methods, we're going to talk more generally about potential issues that we encounter whenever we use a particular sampling method. So the most significant issue that we encounter whenever we're attempting to get a representative sample of the population is something called non-response bias. So non-response bias is a potential systematic difference between those who refuse to participate in a study and those who do participate. Right? So if we go back to the example of opinion polls or surveys over the phone, right? People who do respond to those tend to be people who have very strong opinions or people who fall within a particular category, right? Like they are available during the day because of unemployment or being retirement age, etc., right? So again, the concern with non-response bias becomes that there is a systematic difference between those who do participate in a study and those who do not participate. So this is a silent problem, right? In the sense that the only people that we hear from are the people who agree to participate, whereas we don't hear from anyone who refuses to participate, right? Because they're essentially not involved. They don't answer our survey. They don't fill out a consent form and agree to participate. So we don't really have any information about the people who didn't respond, right? So one really significant example of this, or one significant example of how to overcome this is from a really famous statistician who worked on strategies for improving the survivability of military aircraft, right? So this gentleman, Abraham Wald, had a very specific strategy for working to improve the survivability of aircrafts. So his strategy was as aircraft or as planes returned from their missions, he carefully recorded which parts of the plane had bullet holes and which parts of the plane didn't have bullet holes. Okay, so he made very, very detailed drawings of which parts of the plane had clearly been shot. Okay, as opposed to the parts that were in pristine condition and hadn't been shot, right? So why did he do this? He did this to determine where to put additional armor to make the planes stronger, basically during combat, or more effective, or more likely to survive during combat. So where do you put the extra armor, right? At first, it might seem like the obvious choice is to reinforce areas with the most bullet holes, right? But remember, the planes he examined were the ones that had made it back, from the war or back from battle, right? So inherently, what that suggests is that it's better to reinforce those pristine areas with additional armor, because those pristine areas without bullet holes were those that were most important to the survivability of the aircraft, right? If a plane comes back and survives with numerous bullet holes in the wings, right, but no bullet holes on the sort of middle area of the plane, or the areas in white there, right? What that suggests is that it survived because that particularly vulnerable area wasn't destroyed by bullets, right? So thinking like a scientist, he recommended reinforcing the areas of the planes that appeared to have little damage, right? Why? He reasoned that his samples, non-responders, right, or those aircraft that didn't survive, failed to survive because they were hit in vulnerable areas. In contrast, the planes that survived were hit elsewhere, right? And these areas where they were shot certainly sustained damage, but not enough damage for the plane to go down or for the plane to crash, right? So therefore, the places that would cause damage but not enough for the plane to go down were those that didn't need reinforcement, okay? But the most reinforcement should be put in places where that plane did not receive damage, because those were the most important areas for the survivability of the plane, right? Does that make sense, right? So again, we're reinforcing the areas that didn't receive bullets because those are the most important critical areas for the survivability of the plane. Whereas the areas that did receive lots of gunfire are the areas that are less important for the survivability of the plane. So in essence, Abraham Wald was able to overcome the non-response bias by making a critical inference about the non-responders based on the planes that actually came back. Okay? Another problem we have in the domain of sampling is what's called the volunteer participant problem. So this is a limitation in the extent to which research conclusions based on volunteer research participants can truly generalize to others, because volunteers differ from non-volunteers in meaningful ways. Okay? So let me give you some examples. Okay? So in the 1930s, Alfred Kinsey, who was a renowned psychologist studying sexuality, conducted a study in which he interviewed 12,000 men and 8,000 women about their sexual preferences. And what Kinsey found is that almost half of the males and over a quarter of the females had engaged in homosexual behavior by the time they were middle-aged. Okay? So at the time, these results were very surprising and controversial. And many researchers criticized Kinsey because the sample was comprised solely of volunteers and could therefore bias his results, such that volunteers are high in characteristics like self-esteem, right, and confidence, and maybe extroversion, and thus they may have different sexual attitudes than the general population, right? So that's one instance where we don't know based on the results whether that's true of the general population or the people who did volunteer for the study differ in some systematic way from the people that didn't volunteer for the study. Okay. Okay, so another thing that we have to be aware of is that people who participate in research studies tend to be better educated, they tend to be more intelligent, they tend to have a greater need for social approval, and they also tend to be in a higher strata for socioeconomic status, right? So this again could potentially bias results if researchers are looking at something like a willingness to make a charitable donation, right? So again, because people who volunteer for research tend to be from a higher SES or have more money, okay, they might be more likely to make a charitable donation, not because of what you're manipulating in your study, but rather because that population differs in some way from people that didn't volunteer for the study. Okay, but there are ways to combat this. Okay, and the ways to limit the volunteer problem are potentially by making your study as interesting and non-threatening as possible. Okay, so studies have shown that if you make the descriptions of your study interesting and generally appealing, and you also make them seem very non-threatening or non-controversial, you're more likely to get a more general or representative sample of volunteers than you would be otherwise. A related problem that we have is something called the college sophomore problem. Okay, so I'm just going to read you this quote really quick because it's a nice synopsis of this issue. So it says, the existing science of human behavior is largely the science of the behavior of college sophomores. Too much research effort is expended on college students with the subsequent waste of journal space devoted to speculation concerning whether findings hold for mankind in general. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, by and large, most psychologists take advantage of convenience sampling, okay? And the assumption that they make is that if they use Psych 101 students as their primary sample, okay, because psychological processes are universal to all humans, that sample of Psychology 101 students is going to be an adequate representation of the population, right? So this is basically the psychological realism idea, that if I make the conditions of my experiment such that they evoke the same psychological processes that occur in the general population, it doesn't matter whether my sample is comprised of college students because these processes occur across all humans, or they're universal, right? So the issue is that psychology's heavy reliance on undergraduate research participants could potentially be problematic, right? So one possibility is that college students mimic other older adults and less educated people in their thoughts and other psychological processes, right? But several researchers have called that assumption into question, right? So a lot of researchers have found that psychologists tend to focus on American college students and bias their conclusions concerning the universal nature of psychological processes, right? So because most of our students are young Americans, there are certain cross-cultural and age-different processes that aren't well represented. Okay, and another study found that research published in the 6 best journals of the American Psychological Association, again, tended to use mostly American students, particularly those of European descent. Right? So what does that mean? Okay. Well, can we assume psychological realism with samples of just college students? Or are we relying on samples of Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic people, right? So when we isolate our samples to just college students of primarily American and Eastern European descent, okay, there are specific qualities of these samples that differ significantly from the broader population, right? So again, most of the people that participate in psychological experiments are from Western countries, they are educated, they are from industrialized, rich, and democratic nations, okay? But given what we know about how cognitive and motivational processes are not necessarily universal, right? So those processes, psychological processes differ significantly across cultures, right? So for example, people from westernized cultures tend to overemphasize characteristics of the individual, whereas individuals from Eastern cultures tend to emphasize more characteristics of the situation, right? So they're less likely to commit the fundamental attribution error, where they look at individual characteristics of people rather than characteristics of the situation, right? So what that suggests is, again, that a lot of these psychological processes that are evoked in westernized, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic students differ from those in other nations who speak different languages and have different cultural affiliations. Okay, so how do we solve this problem? How do we utilize samples that are more representative of the population? Well, one of the things we can do is utilize something called MTurk. So Mechanical Turk is a program that Amazon created that allows you to use samples from all different countries. So for example, people from China and other Asian countries, people from India, and access these particular populations for experiments instead of just relying on people from the United States, right? And this is really interesting. So for example, a colleague of mine looked at attitudes toward learning in Asian countries as opposed to the United States. And she found that people living in China are more likely to subscribe to the view that learning is flexible, right? So, for example, the idea that we don't just come into the world with knowledge, but becoming knowledgeable about particular subjects and attaining mastery of information takes perseverance and skill. Okay, so that's called a growth mindset toward learning, whereas people in the United States tend to subscribe to a fixed view of learning. So they tend to believe that skills, particularly in math and other STEM fields, are kind of fixed. So you're either born with it or you don't have it at all, right? So it doesn't matter how much you practice or how much you study, you're always going to be poor in those areas, okay? So only by looking at those populations and comparing them to our westernized, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies can we really see how psychological processes differ. Okay, so that's the most important, those are the most important problems that we have to be aware of when sampling, or how our samples might differ in some meaningful way from the population. Okay, all right, so that is the end of this video, and certainly if you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.